Good morning to all of you. Today, as Thijs already mentioned, I want to talk about the common city. As you can see, the word common is in quotation. So the question is, of course, how common is the city? How accessible is it for different kind of groups in society? Has the city become a place for higher educated people, for people who have certain financial possibilities, or is it a city for all of us? This is a question, I guess, which is embedded in this title, and the subtitle says something different. It says, "In search of the homo duplex," and I want to introduce this concept, old concept from a French sociologist called Emile Durkheim, to connect this to this idea of the common city, because I think this idea of the homo duplex is a very helpful concept to have a look at this current condition of the city itself. So these two things will be at the center of my story of this morning. As I already told you, this sociologist Emile Durkheim from the 19th century, beginning of the 20s, introduced to us this idea of the homo duplex. And of course, the question is, what is this idea of the homo duplex? And what Durkheim wanted to show is that the human being exists on two levels and is constantly oscillating, going up and down between two ways of existence. On the one hand, there's this idea of the profane, and on the other hand, the idea of the sacred. The profane is something, if you have to translate it in a sentence or a phrase, is something like, I'd like to. It has to do something with your individual wants, your individual needs. And on the other hand, there's at the same time another emotion which many of you might experience, is the idea that at the same time you want to transcend yourself. You want to go above your own needs and wants. You want to experience something which you could call like a collective conscience or a collective emotion. So there is on the one hand this idea of the bodily needs and drives, and on the other hand the idea of wanting to transcend it and wanting to experience, wanting to be part of something bigger than that. So on the one hand, this homo duplex of us drives us or pushes us to the direction of individual act, and to satisfy our needs and wants and desires, and on the other hand, the need to perceive or experience something like a commonality between us and others, other humans or non-humans. Important to understand is that this is not something which coexists next to each other. There's not something like the individual experience and the collective experience. They exist because they are they're next to each other. They can't exist without each other, so to say. And in that sense, what Emile Durkheim tries to show, and the way I interpreted it, is that it has to do something with what you might call a relational doubleness. This doubleness, on the one hand, wanting to be an individual, so to say, and wanting to be part of a commonality, of a community. This doubleness is related to each other, and it's a constant oscillation, a constant going back and forth between these two kind of states of being. And you can see it as well in the way we look at the body and the mind, or the subject and the object. There's no subject if we say there is an object, or there is no human if we don't have the concept of the non-human. You could, of course, debate in how far there's a real difference between those two poles, but the fact is that we experience life in this duality, these two poles. And it's the same accounts for something like nature and culture, or on and offline nowadays. So if we take in account this concept of the human, the idea that the human nature persists in this duality, then if we look and we shift to the city, and we see the city as a kind of a manifestation of the self, then the question is, of course, what about the sacred in our cities? If we take for example the city of Amsterdam, we all know the phrase "I am Amsterdam." And the interesting thing about the phrase "I am Amsterdam" is that something like a collective experience is interpreted as something individual. I am the city. I am this. Instead of might be we are Amsterdam. Or of course the city is a place for individuality, but at the same time it is also a collective thing. It can only persist, it can only exist because of the fact that we have found a structure in which individuality finds its way. So if we go a bit further and we think about that idea of the common, and if we could, well, this is just, for example, what Wikipedia says about the commons. Wikipedia says the commons is the cultural and natural resources accessible to all members of society, including natural materials such as air, water, and habitable earth. These resources are held in common, not owned privately. So if we just for now take this as an interpretation of what is the commons, or the common in the city, in this example, then the question is, of course, how is the current condition in relation to this idea of the commons in our cities? Let me, for example, take the idea of natural resources. Here we have a picture of the level of carbon dioxide in our, this is just, I could take a picture of China, that will be the easy way, but this is just a picture of the Netherlands, and we can also clearly see that our air is maybe not something as common as we perceive that it is. It is polluted in a sense. Recently in Amsterdam, last year, there were some new results on also the level of carbon dioxide in certain parts of the cities, and there were certain parts of the cities which were far above the average or the acceptable level. So you could say that, yeah, this idea that we all have the right to have clean air doesn't really account for many cities nowadays. The same accounts for living in the city. We all, I guess more and more we are familiar with the idea of the gentrification. In the main bigger cities in the Netherlands, this is just, for example, Berlin, and this is not even before Berlin became very hip. So this is the end of the 20th century. Then the 21st century still has to begin, but we can already clearly see here a shift in which the red is the share of blue and white collar people, this working class area, is slowly diminishing. It will be interesting to see how this map looks like nowadays. And then arises the question in the far, who can afford to live in the city? Huh? So here you can also see that this idea of the common pops up, and it makes us think about, how accessible is the city for many of us to live in. Of course, there are differences between cities, but in general, we could say that the city has been gentrifying lately. Another aspect is the just more regular physical environment in which we live, the parks we go to, the public spaces, so to say. Here we have an example of a New York artist which thought about designing a park chair where you have to pay to sit down. You can see here's a place to put in a coin, and then the spikes sort of say go down, and you'll be able to sit. Of course, this is an exaggeration, but the point is many of our public spaces has been privatizing in the last couple of decades. So have been part of the corporate world, or have in more a way certain ways not been that accessible as it were in the past. Another attention, if you look at the commons as a natural resources or a public space or something like a place to live, then on the other hand, you could also say there are also something like a cultural commons. It is not only in stones or physical appearance, it has also something to do with a certain cultural helping source, as the common is. Something like, for example, attention. If we look at the way many of contemporary societies have been evolving, then you could easily say that the idea that we have the right, maybe sometimes, not to be addressed in certain ways by advertisement or other kinds of ways, is being eroding, is being slowly replaced by a world in which we have, which there is constantly an address to kind of capture our attention in many ways. This is an art piece of Keiichi Matsuda. It's actually a video called Hyperreality. It is a futuristic kind of dystopian world in which people have accepted augmented reality in their daily lives, but the whole city scenery is fully captured by all kinds of advertisements, media. So you can clearly see it's really hard way to orient it yourself, and something like not the right not to be addressed in certain areas of the city has disappeared. On the other hand, there are some examples of cities which made some decisions in this. For example, Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo decided, I think 8 or 9 years ago, to erase all the advertisement in the city itself. Here you see a few examples of those places which in the past were billboards but are now empty. And the reason why the local municipality did this was because they thought there was too much aesthetic pollution. Nothing like air pollution, but aesthetic pollution in the city, and they wanted to clean up the city aesthetically, to give more space to experience the city in many ways, instead of experiencing the city by seeing all the ads which are part of the city, instead of the buildings or other aspects. So the question for me at the point is where can the homo duplex, if we say this is something which describes the human in a way which fits this debate on the common city, then the question is where can this homo duplex go to? Where does he find his duality the best, and here and then in the future? Let me just give a few examples of. In the way, I guess, in small, you can still see certain areas, places, or projects in which this idea of the common is being manifested on different levels. If we could say there is something like a social, cultural, physical, ecological elements in the city, which all are bound together, or not separate, then we could ask ourselves the question, where do we meet? Where do we meet others, which are not part of our local community or local subculture? In sociology, there's a concept which they call public familiarity. And the idea about public familiarity is that we do not live in a village. In a village, everyone knows each other. You know, the local grocery store, your neighbors. But in the city, it defines itself that there is a certain level of anonymity. There is this is also giving a certain freedom in the city. Still, it is for sociologists clear that there is something needed in the city as well, in the social level, which they call public familiarity, in which you are able to recognize and being recognized by others. That there is a certain way of knowing what kind of people live in your area without knowing them personally. Interesting example of this is when I got a dog 6-7 months ago. I experienced that having a dog means that you at a certain point experience a certain forms of communities in your local area, which before that were not visible that much. This is just research of a few social scientists which did a research in the United States on the effect of dogs for local communities and dog parks. And what they saw is that it is a way of unleashing community and social capital between the local inhabitants of this area. Here just an example of such a dog park. Another example of a Dutch research from Joke van der Zwaard called Scenes in the Copy Corner is a way of showing that a local copy shop is a place where people from all kinds of classes, all kinds of backgrounds meet each other just on a very low level way and are getting familiar with what kind of people do live in my area actually. If we more look at the physical, this is a very famous research done by William White, an urbanist from the 80s, 90s in New York. The local municipality asked William White, why is it that certain parks, certain squares in New York are not that popular than others? What he did a research with a group of 30, 40 people, and they were just observing for a few weeks what is really actually happening in these squares. And eventually he had two main insights, which were so obvious, but in many ways designers overlooked this kind of elements. The first one was people tend to sit where there are places to sit. There are many squares, for example, where there's no way to sit down. People want to sit down, and this is what good squares characterizes good squares. Another one is the number of one activity is people looking at other people. If there's no way of looking at other people and a nice place to sit down, this area is easily not very popular. It's absolutely a tip to watch this movie. It's funny, narrated as well by William White, but I think these just very simple insights are in many ways are overlooked in the designs of our public spaces. Another example of the way space is very influential in the way of stimulating the social or not is this example of the shared spaces, which is now being adopted, which has been adopted by Amsterdam in the back of the central station. They incorporated this aspect of the shared spaces in which you have a traffic junction in which all the signs have been removed. And what happens when all the signs remove is then people are going to pay attention to each other, because then the space becomes a social space in which people have to look at each other. Okay, there's an old lady coming down. She might be slow, so I have to take care of my driving at that moment. And the interesting thing is that it really works. The number of accidents go down, and actually this place becomes a social space in a sense. Another one, for example, is of course the role of the online, or what they say nowadays, the on-live world, in which, for example, the Pokemon mania in this summer shows in a way also that these games can take care of a certain form of community building between, in this particular example, young people. Let me just end with this question for all of you as artists, designers who are in a way preoccupied with maybe the city in a sense, is that for me the question is, of course, what role could art play in this whole context? And I would say that could be going on many ways, but the question is, in what way can art produce certain urban imaginaries of that commonality without losing, and that's quite important for me, this doubleness, this ambiguity that is also what makes good art. I just will give you just one example which is from Dries Voorwinde, Dutch theater maker. And I will just want to read down something which was on the website, which I thought was just a very, very nice way of just summarizing what is actually happening here. In an installation which reminds most people of a hotel, a spectator lies alone on a bed. A 400-meter square mirror hangs directly above. The visitor sees himself or herself in the mirror ceiling. By exchanging letters and notes passed under the doors, visitors communicate with performers in the hallway. The mirror rises, the bed zooms out. Just like with Google Earth, the spectator gets a view of the lives of the people next to him. He sees the other visitors lying along in their rooms and hears details about all these people in a story about a collective state of being. After an hour, the mirror drops back to the starting point. The visitor is alone again. I guess this is a nice way of showing this idea of the homo duplex, the idea that human nature is double and is constantly oscillating between individual experience, collective experience, without making a choice in these directions. Thank you very much.